Today, we're talking about the biggest lies, misconceptions, and problems with buying a tiny home to live in right now. As you probably already know, home prices are going through the roof all over the country, including right here in Las Vegas. And that's leading a lot of people to look for affordable housing via maybe a tiny home. But guys, let me tell you, beware, it's not always as straightforward as a lot of people tell you it is. So stay tuned because we're going to go over all the problems and we're getting after it right now. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel and thanks for tuning in for another video. My name's Tom and I'm a local realtor here in Las Vegas. If you watch the news, if you're a home buyer, maybe you already own a home, you know that the home prices over the last year over the entire country are going absolutely bananas. Here in Las Vegas, we're up something like 22% from last year at this exact time, and I'm shooting this video in September of 2021. So if you're a home buyer, you know, like I said, home prices are high and it's hard to find affordable housing in a lot of different cities. Now, that's leading people to buy tiny homes, right? You've probably heard about this craze of living in a tiny home. Maybe you've seen it on HGTV or on some other program. And it's becoming a craze. It's been around since the 80s, but it's really gaining popularity now with this whole minimalistic lifestyle because people want to live, debt-free. They want to move around the country a lot, and they don't want to spend a lot on a house that they're not necessarily, spending a lot of time in besides sleeping and cooking. However, there are a lot of misconceptions, lies, and problems with tiny homes that you don't always hear. You don't see them on the news, and you're certainly not seeing them on HGTV. So today, we're going to go over all those problems, misconceptions, and we're going to tell you how you can avoid them so that if you want to go through a tiny home and you want to find that more affordable piece of living, you won't run into any of these problems. And just before we do that, guys, please go down below, subscribe, like, and hit that little notification bell so you're notified every single time I put out a video. And with that, let's jump right into the number one first problem with tiny homes. The first problem you're going to run into, and it's not that common to hear about this, is that it's very difficult to get a loan for a tiny home. And that's the case because government-backed loans, that you would get like for a conventional mortgage on a $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 house, or really any house, government-backed loans like that have a minimum limit, and that limit is around $65,000. So if you're buying a tiny home and it's valued at less than $65,000, there is a good chance you will not be able to get a conventional mortgage or any kind of mortgage that you would have on an actual house on that tiny home. And even if the tiny home is worth, say, $100,000, same thing. There's a chance that those normal banks like Chase Bank or maybe Wells Fargo, Bank of America, whoever you guys want to use, there's a good chance that they will not fund that loan. They won't give you the money to buy it. So this is a common problem people run into, and it's not really talked about. But luckily, there are a number of different ways around it. The simplest way to get around this issue is to simply buy your home in cash if you can afford it. If the home is $50,000 and you have $50,000 running around, just purchase a tiny home in cash. That'll avoid the lender completely. You won't have an interest rate because the home will be all yours, and you won't have to worry about getting a loan or anything like that. This is definitely more likely on a tiny home than a normal conventional home because let's just face it, tiny homes are generally a lot cheaper than normal homes. So hopefully you guys can afford that and just avoid this problem completely. But if you can't, there are a few other options. There's a company called Lightstream, LIGHTSTREAME. They are a loan company and they give loans for all sorts of pretty much random stuff, guys. I mean, that's their business. They, in some cases, will finance your tiny home. One thing you do have to worry about if you are, if you are getting a loan on your tiny home is, since it's a specialty loan product, right? It's not really that common. So many more, just normal homes with normal home mortgages are sold and bought than tiny homes. Expect that interest rate, that annual percentage rate or APR, to be higher, in some cases significantly higher. In some cases, significantly higher than a normal mortgage. And I've seen rates like 5 or 6% for a tiny home loan versus right now, I mean, you can get a loan from a lender for like 2.85, 3%, 3.5%, depending on your credit. So no matter, depending on your credit, depending on the type of the tiny home and some other stuff, just be aware you're probably going to pay a higher interest rate. But that being said, the loan amount is generally going to be far less, or at least a good portion less than the loan would be on a normal home. So even if you do have a 5% interest rate, that monthly payment will still probably be pretty affordable in all likelihood. Next thing we're going to talk about is price. Now, a lot of people get into tiny homes because they think they're going to save a ton of money. They think it's way more affordable, and in some cases it is. However, that's not always the truth. I mentioned on number one that tiny homes can sell for $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 or even more, depending on their location, depending on if they're on a trailer or not, if they're on a foundation or not, what kind of foundation, what is the exact location, how much land comes with the tiny home. All of these things need to be factored in to the affordability of that tiny home. And if you're strictly looking at the price of the tiny home, there's another thing you need to be aware of, and that is cost per square foot. So homes nowadays are often measured in cost per square foot. As homes get larger, generally that cost per square foot, starts to come down. And as they get smaller and more compact, that price per square foot goes up. And that is the case with tiny homes, because you still have to pay people to build, you still have to pay for materials, but tiny homes are kind of that specialty build, right? A lot of them aren't built. You're not building them in mass like you are normal conventional homes that might be built in a 100, 200, 500 home lot, right? Where that builder's getting that big discount on construction materials and worker labor and all that sort of thing. So tiny homes can range anywhere from about $100 to even up to about $500 a square foot. So you might be thinking you're getting a great deal for that 200 or 300 square foot tiny home, but when you look at the price per square foot, it could be significantly higher than a normal home or condo or townhome or some other type of home that's just more common. So that's important to factor that into your decision and know that you're probably going to be paying more per square foot up front than you would for another type of home. But that being said, even if you are paying more per square foot, in many cases, yes, the tiny home does come out to be more affordable overall. But again, you need to factor that interest rate in. 5% on a $100,000 tiny home loan, you're still looking at a pretty big payment versus a 2.5% loan on a $300,000 normal home in some neighborhood of Las Vegas or wherever you live. So just keep that in mind. Make sure you're really keeping track of those dollars and cents. Do what makes sense to you, do what's affordable for you, but just know it's not always necessarily more affordable in some cases to get into a tiny home than it is to get into a normal home. Number 3 on the list, guys, we're going to be talking about where you can actually park your tiny home. And that is a huge part of the process. And I feel like that's a huge part that people just kind of glaze over. They think, oh, I'm going to go get my tiny home, put it on a trailer, and now I'm going to travel the country and live this beautiful travel lifestyle, work from home. In some cases, you can totally get away with that, guys. In other cases, you're going to be surprised about where you can and cannot park your tiny home. And like I said, this is something I think people look over a lot. They gloss over it, but it's super, super important because you don't want to be you got to have a place to live. You got to have a place to actually park the tiny home, whether it's attached to your trailer or whether you're putting it on a foundation. Regardless, you got to have a place to put it. So reason this is a problem, guys, is because many communities do not allow structures on their land, permanent structures, temporary structures, for people to live in that are less than 600 square feet. So if you're buying a tiny home and you're thinking you're just going to be able to live in your city in some of these different lots that you can purchase, or maybe outside the city on some government land, something like that, you need to make sure you check with whoever owns the land, any governing boards for the land, maybe the county, city, the state. Figure out what they allow, what's not allowed. Maybe check with some local HOAs in that area to see what kind of structures they allow, because you don't want to get in trouble and you don't want to park your tiny home anywhere that you're not allowed to park your tiny home. Now, as far as places that you will be allowed to park it for some period of time, you can do a search in your area for tiny home parks. So this is kind of like an RV park, only it's specific to tiny homes where you can pull your tiny home up. But depending on the rules of the park, you might have to take the wheels off and set it on a foundation or set it on the ground or whatever their rules are. So you're going to want to check with them make sure you can keep the wheels on so you can stay mobile, or if you do want to set it down, find out what the monthly rent is for the space, how long you're allowed to rent the space. Maybe they only allow renting for 6 months or a year, and then you have to move it. All of these things really need to be considered before you decide where you're going to park your tiny home. Next on the list, and I kind of already mentioned this, but RV parks. So RV parks also sometimes allow you to pull your tiny home in and keep the wheels on, take up a lot. Like I said, the rules are different for every RV park, every single tiny home park. So you need to check with whoever administers the laws or for that area, that sort of thing. You need to check with the people who actually own the RV park, find out how long you can stay there, find out what the rent is, and find out if you can maybe even pay in advance or pay for a year in advance. But some RV parks, since they're geared towards RVs, recreational vehicles specifically, and people traveling the country on vacation, sometimes they only allow a 30-day max stay. And if that's the case, you're gonna have to have another RV park or tiny home park lined up for you to move to after that 30 days is up. So you can see how important this is and how quickly someone can get into trouble by parking their tiny home somewhere that they shouldn't be parking it. Another thing to consider, guys, is, and this is something that's not really known unless you take a deep dive into tiny homes, is what standards was that tiny home constructed to? And there's a couple different set of standards, but the common ones are going to be like HUD standards, Housing and Urban Development Standards. That's what normal homes, like the one I'm in, are built to. So if your tiny home was built to HUD standards, then where you can park it and that sort of thing, that might open up to you, or that might close off some options because they might only allow RVs, they might allow some other kind of home. But check and see what the standards are, and this is also going to be important for insurance, which we'll talk about later. The next standard you can build tiny homes to is called PMRV, and that stands for Park Model Recreational Vehicle. So that's very similar to RV standards in that it is some kind of a recreational vehicle, but this is a really important distinction because RV standards are not built, or RVs are not built for long-term continuous use. They're built for short range, use, maybe a month or 2 months or a week or something like that. They're not built for long-term continuous use. So again, this might affect where you can park your tiny home and where you can't because of the standards of how it was built. And they're going to say, hey, you can only park, HUD standard homes here, or you can only bring your PRMV into this RV park. So if it's built to a house, you can't bring it in. All these sorts of things are to be considered. Before we go on to number 4, guys, if you haven't already, please go down below, like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you get notified every single time I put out a new video. Next, let's talk about insurance. And just like getting a loan on your tiny home, insurance on your tiny home also gets really complicated because it's very specialty. And we're gonna factor in a few different things we've talked about, namely how the tiny home was built, where it's parked. That's what's really going to affect insurance, and also how you paid for it. Do you have a loan on it, or do you own it outright? And the reason this is important, guys, is because this is your house. No matter the standards it was built to, no matter where you park it, whether it has wheels or whether it's on a foundation, it is where you live. It has all your stuff in it. It has your family in it. So you need to have it insured. You need to have every aspect of your tiny home insured, just like you would if you were living in a normal house. That way, if the worst happens, you're not going to be, destroyed financially, even if your tiny home, burns down or something horrible like that happens. So the type of insurance you get is going to depend on the loan and the standard that the home was built to. It's also important to note that since tiny home insurance is a specialty, it's often just as expensive, if not more expensive, to insure a tiny home than it is to insure a normal home in a normal neighborhood. So here's where that affordability factor of a tiny home kind of backfires, because it's a smaller home, it's worth a lot less, more than likely than a normal home, but you're still going to be paying the same amount, if not more, for insurance. If you have a tiny home, you're looking to buy one, the specialty insurance companies are kind of rare. You're going to want to go to insurify.com. That's a good way to start. See if you can find somewhere through there. It's kind of an insurance portal that'll be able to insure your tiny home. It's also another insurance company called Lloyds of London, Lloyds of London. They are a specialty insurance company, and they also do tiny home insurance, so you can check with them. Another type of insurance you definitely want to consider is flood insurance, guys. If you are parking your tiny home in a low-lying area for a long period of time, or maybe it's permanent, it's on a foundation that's going to be there, or even maybe you travel the southern United States a lot through Florida, through Louisiana, parts of Texas. If you're going to be there during hurricane season, during flood season, you might want to consider getting flood insurance. Now, I'm not an insurance expert, but I do know that some flood insurances will only cover the structure, whereas others will cover the structure plus all of the contents of the home. And the type of insurance you really want is the one that covers the structure and the contents. Because if it does flood and your home gets destroyed, you're going to be out all of the money to replace all of your stuff on the inside of the home if you didn't have the contents of the home insured. So make sure you're getting the right insurance, the best insurance for you that covers every aspect of the home. Additionally, maybe you have solar panels or some kind of external power generation or water pump or any number of other pieces of equipment. Guys, you're going to want to make sure all of those are insured as well. Anything that could possibly break that is kind of like a utility to the home or that augments the home, you're going to want to get insurance on it, because solar panels for a tiny home can be expensive, external water supplies can be expensive. All this stuff adds up very quickly, and if the worst could happen, you want to make sure you're insured so that you're not financially devastated. And the number 5 thing to keep in mind is going to be maintenance on your tiny home. Any of you homeowners out there, or if you grew up and your parents owned a home, you're probably familiar with home maintenance or with wanting to upgrade the home, replace older things in the home like appliances, all that sort of stuff. That same thing happens with tiny homes, only now you have the added problem of the fact that tiny homes, like we already talked about, are a very specialty build, right? They're not usually produced in mass quantity like normal homes in normal neighborhoods are. And the reason this causes a problem is because many of the items like stoves, sinks, are very niche and only built for tiny homes. So they're built in a small number, So they're built in a small number, or maybe some of the things you have in your home are completely custom, completely one-off. If something were to happen to your one-off sink, that there's, it's the only sink in the world that's like that, and it was built specifically for your tiny home. Say you drop a dish and you cracks your sink. Well, now you got a leaky sink. You can't use your faucet in your sink because it's going to leak through, but now you got to replace it. But who do you call to replace your custom tiny home sink? You could be 1,000 miles from where the manufacturer of that tiny home was, and you can't just go to Home Depot to get another tiny home sink because Home Depot doesn't stock them, right? It's a specialty item, or maybe it's even a one-off item. So it's important to note that maintenance on a tiny home can often be very expensive when you're replacing those niche, specific tiny home items, appliances, countertops even. When you're replacing those items, you just have to make sure, do your due diligence, really search out who makes them, make sure you have item numbers and all that stuff written down beforehand so you know who to go to. Even if you blow a tire on your tiny home trailer, or if your countertop cracks, or whatever the case may be, guys, make sure you know who makes it and where you can get it fixed as quickly as possible so that you're not out an appliance or out your sink or something like that. Or maybe it's plumbing. You don't want to have a plumbing problem and then not be able to fix it because it's a specialty part. So just keep a track of where all those parts are, who makes them, how you can get more, and make sure you know up front that it's often going to be more expensive to replace those parts than it would be if you were just living in a normal home. But as far as maintenance goes, the amount of maintenance on a tiny home, I could definitely see that being a lot less than on a normal house because the square footage is a lot less, right? So you're going to have less siding on your house. You're going to have a smaller roof to replace. You're going to have less plumbing. All of these things are going to be in smaller quantities. But there's another factor that with the tiny home that you don't get with a normal home, and that is if you're moving your tiny home and it's on a trailer, now you got to consider the damage or the additional maintenance that you're going to have to do because you're driving that tiny home through the rain at 80 miles an hour on the highway, and maybe a piece of siding peels off, or maybe you lose some shingles. All of these things are to be considered because these don't happen with a normal home. You're not driving your normal home down the highway and hitting bumps and causing your appliances to get damaged or anything like that. None of that stuff happens with a normal home. And that's something people don't always consider. So just keep all that in mind when you're thinking about maintenance and affordability of that tiny home. There's a lot of things that happen to tiny homes that don't necessarily happen to normal homes. Guys, if you have any more questions, comments, please put them down below. In fact, if you live in a tiny home or you know someone that lives in a tiny home, please comment down below what their thoughts about the tiny home living lifestyle was. How big was their tiny home? How long did they live in it? any information you guys can put in the comments is going to help the next person, and it's going to help this video be even more informative than it already is. And with that, guys, you've probably seen some videos pop up. Please click on those videos, head over to my channel, watch some more videos. If you have any other questions about living in the Las Vegas area or anything like that, and if you want to reach out to me, all my contact information is down below. Please reach out, because I'm getting reach outs all the time, but I'm never too busy to help you and to answer your questions. Thanks so much, guys, for watching. Please stay tuned for more content and have a great day.